Let's explore the difference between Torah and the words of Naveem, of prophets, because each one has a role to play. And specifically, the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu helps to consolidate the Torah. We see it in this week's parasha. We're going to examine it in what the Rambam writes about Nevuah in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. So in our parasha, in our parasha, we have the pasuk that says the instruction that you have to listen to the Navi. From there we learn that you have to follow the prophet that may be in any time in history. The Rambam comments on that in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah that that any Navi that will ever emerge after Moshe Rabbeinu, we don't believe in the validity of that Navi because they give a sign or they do a miracle. We believe the Navi because we're instructed in the Torah that Moshe instructed us in the Torah and said, and he said, that if the Navi will prove himself with the various signs, then you have to listen to him. So it's not the sign that makes him valid, it's the instruction in the Torah that says such a person should be followed and considered as a Navi. Now, the fact that the Rambam says you don't believe in Navi just simply because of the sign that he's done, that's musbar behegin bepash. It's actually quite logical. Because it's possible for people to produce signs using dark energy or inappropriate sources. Which implies as as this is nit let's say that a Navi was able to do something and we're absolutely 100% clear that what they have done is not from any corrupted source. Over Mele, as there's a Navi MS, which obviously would then prove to us that this is a genuine Navi who we should believe. So logic would say we would then have to follow that Navi, even if the Torah had not specifically mandated, listen to him. Because he's a Navi, he's proven himself. Obviously what he's saying is Hashem's word. So what's the added value over here by knowing that there's a tzivoy, that there's an instruction in the Torah that says not only is it logical to follow a Navi if he can prove himself, but you really have to follow the Navi because the Torah mandates. So we'll understand that based on a principle which we've learned elsewhere. Is aber al pi hayodua, when you consider what we know, benegea the mitzvahs of Hilchos is given at tzivoy oich far matan Torah. We know that there are certain mitzvahs that were instructed even before the Torah was given, like a bris milah, even Shabbos that was given at Morah, and others. As the fact that we fulfill those mitzvahs now is, again, quoting the Rambam, we don't have a bris today because Avraham did. We don't avoid Gid HaNoshe because Yaakov was injured. We do those things because Moshe instructed us in the Torah that that's what we have to do. And therefore, it's a loish HaKadosh Baruch Hu amazel lenevim shelefonav. It's not on the basis of the fact that Hashem communicated that information to earlier Nevi'im. So using that same logic is verstandig, we can understand as al derech zeh is oich benegea di tzivuim shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu durch Nevi'im noch matan Torah. Just as we can distinguish between words conveyed by or to a prophet before matan Torah compared to things that were instructed in the Torah, we're going to make a similar distinction between words that are communicated through a Navi after matan Torah versus things that are said in the Torah, in this case, the mitzvah to listen to the Navi. As mitzad atzmam, if you only look at the words or the communications to a Navi in and of themselves, so haben sie nicht in sich dem Teuke von mitzvahs shetziva besinai. The words of a Navi, even if that Navi lives after Matan Torah, do not have the same power and impact as words that were instructed at Har Sinai. So therefore, if we were just relying on the fact that a Navi is a Navi because he can prove himself, it wouldn't be as powerful as the fact that we have to listen to the Navi because Moshe instructs us in the Torah. Okay, moving oich from the Kolos v'Lapidim v'chulei. Here's another way we can understand it from all the great drama that surrounded the giving of the Torah. Was only given bam matan Torah, the sounds and the lightning, etc. Und afal pichen is nit far heminu bo Yisrael. And in spite of all of that amazing light and sound show, that's not why we accept and believe the Torah. Because if we did believe in the validity of the Torah because of the massive experience at Har Sinai, then we'd actually be saying we believe what Moshe said because of the accompanying signs, which would imply that it's not the strength of the Torah, it's the strength of the signs. Now, but again, quoting the Rambam, the single greatest evidence that we have to the validity of Torah is the human witnessing that happened of the Jewish people at Har Sinai, as the pasuk says clearly, how will people come to trust in you, Moshe, forever? This is Hashem speaking to Moshe. Because people will see me appear and engage with them personally. In other words, there's no surrounding sounds or signs, lightning, thunder, etc., that give validity to Moshe's position or to the validity of the Torah. It's because we know that Hashem engaged us directly. So we're making a distinction over here between words that come through a Navi, which may or may not have the strength of the accompanying signs and wonders, versus something that is mandated by the Torah, which is the clearest, most obvious, and most powerful basis for anything that we should believe. On the Rebbe is the Rambam Medayik. That's why the Rambam is so specific in Hilchos Yesod HaTorah. And he says, why do we listen to a Navi? Because there's a mitzvah given by Moshe in the Torah that we have to listen to that Navi. And therefore, once we now define that this is a mitzvah contained within Torah, that adds a whole different power and validity to the Navi's perspective, or his offering, or his words, more than if it was just simply prophetic words. And just to illustrate the point, we know that in halacha there are very serious distinctions between something that is written and spoken about in the Torah directly versus something that is only mentioned by the Naveem. So by the Rambam telling us that Eilov Tishmon gives the power, the force of a mitzvah to the words of a Navi, that helps us to understand a much deeper appreciation for why the Navi's words are so powerful. Now that's all fine and good, but once we start to analyze what the Rambam's actually saying, we're going to notice that there are one or two elements that don't seem necessarily to be so clear. Because based on what we've just said, why do we follow a Navi? Because the Torah says we must, and not because of the proofs that the Navi may produce through various signs and wonders. In other words, we believe what the Navi says not because he gives the instruction that we should follow his nevuah, but because the Torah gives the instruction that we should follow his nevuah. So with that information, in Rambam, the continuation of the section that we're learning in the 8th chapter of the Rambam about the Navi, this is where things don't necessarily appear to be so clear. Because for as Meirich as das was ihnen haben geglaubt in Nevuas Moshe Rabbeinu, there the Rambam says, okay, besides the fact that we have to believe every Navi, why is it, says the Rambam, that we take Moshe's Nevuah so seriously and we believe it absolutely, is nit mipnei ha'osos she'osa. The Rambam says, and this sounds so far so good, exactly what we've said, not because of any signs or wonders, not because he turned sticks into snakes, or he made the 10 makos, or he split the sea. Because the axiom is that if a person only believes in a Navi because of the signs that he has performed, the person actually has a lack of faith. Says the Rambam, no. On what basis do we believe in Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah? Because we stood ourselves, our people, each of us, at Har Sinai, and at that environment, in that environment, our eyes saw what happened, not some stranger. It's not secondhand information. And we heard it with our own ears and not through somebody else. Okay, so far so good. Und then noch is a Messiah dem Perek, and then the Rambam concludes the Perek by saying, as lefichach, based on what we now know, that we believe in Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah because we saw it and experienced it ourselves. And the fact that we trust a Navi not because of his miracles, but because of the instruction in the Torah, lefichach, therefore, Navi. Let's say that there was a Navi who emerged, and he made amazing miracles happen, and then he wanted to say something that would contradict Moshe's nevuah, and naturally we would not listen to him. Why? Because this person's credentials would be miracles. And Moshe's credentials are not based on miracles and signs. That we should now start weighing up who did the greater miracle and therefore should be believed more or less. But to echo what the Rambam already said before, we saw and heard the experience of Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah ourselves, therefore we know it is absolutely true and believable. Now, let's analyze this. On what basis, as we've already learned, do we follow a genuine Navi, or nit an andere Navi, as compared to somebody who is a false Navi? Is mitzadem toikef von tzivoy haTorah. We already said, why do we follow the genuine Navi? Because the Torah says, Elav tishman, we have to listen to him. Lo tishmal divrei Navi ahu, as opposed to the other person, where the Torah says, don't listen to him. And not because we have some kind of clarity that he is saying Hashem's word. The Torah tells us to follow him. So therefore, you would expect that this concept, the concept of how you determine whether or not you follow a Navi, should be clear in the Rambam's Sefer Hayad HaChazaka. In other words, it's strange to us that the Rambam would enter or venture into a subject without telling us the clear halacha and more, so to speak, getting into the philosophy of it. In Sefer Hayad, was a Sefer for halachas, the Sefer Hayad is supposed to be clear halacha. Is the od von Rayis al derech halacha. So if you're talking about halacha, you would expect that the proofs you'll bring for a particular halacha will be legal proofs. But this whole philosophical explanation why we wouldn't listen to the other Navi, because of the fact that his miracles actually don't count, because at the end of the day we have the basis of having seen Moshe's testimony ourselves. The logic that says, how can you believe that guy should have any validity when you saw Moshe's nevuah yourself and he's trying to contradict Moshe's nevuah? That doesn't belong in the Yad HaChazaka. Past Mer in Sifrei HaMoreh Shel Rambam. That's the kind of thing you'd expect the Rambam to speak about in Moreh HaNavuchim, which is much more philosophical in its approach. So why does the Rambam get into this conversation? The Rambam should say clearly, why don't we listen to a false Navi? Because the Torah says, Elav Tishmun, this is who you listen to. He doesn't have to give us the whole philosophical background that you saw Moshe's presentation and this fellow is trying to contradict that, and who is he anyway? So instead, really what you would have expected the Rambam to do in the Yad HaChazaka and Mishnah Torah was just to cut to the chase, tell us the halacha. As dos as mitafan gloiben and folgen anovi. Why do we follow prophets? Is not because of the miracles, nor mipnei mitzvah shetziva Moshe b'Torah. This is what the Rambam should have said. We follow a Navi because we have a mitzvah in the Torah, Elav Tishmon, follow a Navi. Even though we don't necessarily know how to prove if the signs that this particular Navi has performed are from healthy or unhealthy sources. And and he could have said the part that if a so-called prophet should arrive and do amazing miracles and then would attempt to contradict anything that Moshe had presented us through his nevuahs, which effectively means that he's rejecting the validity of Torah, then the Rambam should say simply, just don't listen to him. He's contradicting the Torah. That's all we need to know. We don't need to know the whole philosophy of, well, it doesn't make sense that you should listen to that guy when you actually saw Moshe Rabbeinu's presentation with your own eyes. Just say simply, he's against the Torah. The Torah says you have to listen to a Navi. There's obviously no way that a Navi would be mandated by the Torah to go against the Torah. Don't listen to him. So why is the Rambam entering the world of philosophy? That's our first question in Sefer Yad HaChazaka. The second question that we're going to analyze is that it seems that there's detail over here that doesn't really make sense. Nachmer. In the Perek Shalach Reise, so this was in the 8th chapter of Yesod HaTorah. Now we're going to look at the next Perek. You see that the Rambam, in addition to speaking about the principles of prophecy, now makes a link between our faith and belief in the Torah as a whole and the concept of Moshe's nevuah. And we have to ask, why specifically that link? Where do we see this? Because if you have a person who says, Hashem Shalachoi, he comes along, he claims, I'm a prophet, I was sent by God, and my mandate is the Hoisif mitzvah or Ligroya mitzvah, either to add a new mitzvah to the Torah or to remove a mitzvah that was part of the Torah, or to add an interpretation of a mitzvah that we've never heard before, it's not part of our tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu. Or alternatively, or the person comes along and says, look, those mitzvahs, they're mitzvahs that were temporary. They don't actually apply in today's world. So any of those presentations where a person essentially wants to modify the Torah, so obviously we don't listen to them, but listen how the Rambam says it. Zok der Rambam. As there's a Navi Sheker, such a person has to be a false Navi. Because this person is contradicting Moshe's Nevuah. Strange, right? Und dieselbe Sache sagt der Rambam mit Sima Perek, and by the way, the Rambam repeats the same concept at the end of that chapter, but again, it's Einem sagt, when a person should arrive claiming to be a Navi, and he says, Hashem tzivohu shetoivad avodas kechav ma'yom bilvad, and b'shazo bilvad. He says, I'm a Navi, and you've got to serve idolatry, even just now, temporarily, just for this particular moment. There again, the Rambam says, this person is discredited because they contradict Moshe's Nevuah. Isn't it moving? Doesn't make sense. What is this person saying? Reject a mitzvah, add a mitzvah, mitzvahs were only temporary, serve idolatry. Any one of those things, that person is contradicting nit no nevuahs Moshe. He's not just contradicting Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah, no ratzivoi b'Torah. He's contradicting a direct instruction in the Torah. The Torah says clearly, you may not add to the Torah or detract from it. And those things that have been revealed to us and taught us in the Torah are permanent. So why say that this Navi is contradicting Moshe's Nevuah? He's contradicting the fundamentals of Judaism, Torah itself. So hat doch der Rambam gedacht sagen, surely the way the Rambam should have worded it is, that this guy is rejected because he's trying to contradict Torah. Surely a person who wants to contradict the Torah firstly belongs to their own category and a very severe category of heretic, worse surely than somebody who's trying to contradict Moshe's Nevuah, Kanal Sifalef, because we already said before, because we already said that anything that was instructed specifically through a Navi, which is Kolel Kamuvan Oich Nevuas Moshe, including Moshe's prophecies, is not as forceful as a mitzvah that was instructed at Har Sinai. This guy wants to contradict mitzvahs that were given at Har Sinai. Why are we only accusing him of contradicting Moshe's Nevuah? We should have a far stronger opposition to him because he's going against the Torah itself. So we'll try a particular argument. It's not going to work, just to try and explain how to settle this. So the Chayra Voltman Geken Masber Zayin, perhaps we could explain that as the Far Zokta the Rambam lachish nevuase shel Moshe unit lachish Torah, that actually the reason the Rambam wanted specifically to word this as a man who is contradicting Moshe's nevuah rather than a man who is contradicting the Torah. Maybe the Rambam just wanted to say, this is how we know that you can immediately flag this person as a false Navi. And there's a practical application because somebody who is considered a false Navi has certain consequences that he has to face. The Rambam is more free to compare Kanal, as the Rambam already told us, and we learned this already, because Moshe's Nevuah is not based on miracle work, but first-hand evidence of our own personal experience. So maybe the Rambam wants to highlight this guy is clearly nonsensical because he's going against what you saw and you witnessed. In other words, so says, when the Rambam had the Rambam only addressed how serious it is to be a false Navi, because this is a person who says, the person claims to have been sent by Hashem to add to the Torah or detract from the Torah. Yeah, if that's what the Rambam wanted to convey, that the big issue over here is that this person is contradicting the Torah, he would have said so. Is oisen zu geben a time. But the Rambam doesn't just want to tell us what he's doing wrong. The Rambam apparently wants to also tell us why it's so bad what he's doing. Sheharei, that's a word that implies that there's a reason why this is so bad. Varvoser is a Nevi Sheker, why he's considered a false prophet, and therefore Vedina of how he should be treated in Jewish law. That's perhaps why the Rambam added the phrase that he contradicts Moshe's nevuah, just so that we would know that being a Navi Sheker is not just simply about rejecting Torah, but it's about rejecting something that was so clear and obvious to us, and so therefore he's actually quite idiotic. But the Rebbe is completely dissatisfied with this answer. For but we already know this information. The Rambam told it to us in the previous chapter. We already know that any Navi that's going to arrive and suggest anything which is contrary to what Moshe said is ridiculous, because that means that the person is suggesting something that goes against what we have seen with our own eyes. He's already explained it. So then we already know this information. We already know that that's what's so bad about being a Navi Sheker. So we already know what's bad about being a false Navi. Here, at this point, when the person is suggesting things that are against the Torah, this would be the appropriate time for the Rambam to say, and in addition to the fact that this individual is a bad person and a Navi Sheker because he contradicts the obvious, he should also now say, and he contradicts the Torah, which probably brings its own consequences. The question is actually even stronger than we initially thought. It to me is noch aggressor. In the same perek we discover as the Rambam nutz takedem loshen lahachish Torah. The Rambam, in a different conversation, uses the expression to contradict Torah, because you might have thought maybe it's an expression that's not suitable, it doesn't belong in this conversation. Well, look, the Rambam uses it. Look what the Rambam says. Im okar davar midvarim shelomad mipi hashmo. If this so-called, this guy who claims to be a Navi would uproot something that we have a tradition about, or he comes forward with any halacha and says, this is how the halacha should be, we discount him and we call him a false prophet, Sharei bo lahachish Torah, because he's contradicting the Torah. How is he contradicting the Torah? Shamar lo b'shamayim, because the Torah says clearly that the decision about how halacha should happen is not decided in heaven. That means even if this Navi arrives and he paskins something which sounds to us like it could even be the correct halacha, the fact that he claims that the halacha was given to him by Hashem on high is already false. That's lahachish Torah. That goes against the Torah, which says that halacha can only be decided here on earth, not through a prophetic experience. So now we really don't understand why the Rambam, in the one case, says that he contradicts Moshe's nevuah and therefore is a false prophet, and yet in the other case he's quite happy to say he contradicts the Torah and therefore he's a false prophet. So it's verstandig der Schiene. If the guy wants to add or detract a mitzvah, say the mitzvahs are temporary, or he wants to lead people to serve idolatry, that the Rambam calls contradicting Moshe's nevuah. And if a person wants to change halacha or even ratify halacha based on the fact that he's received a message on high, that we call contradicting Torah. Why the distinction? Nachmer. Let's take it a step further. Let's say a person would arrive and claim right, one of the scenarios that the Rambam described. Person arrives, claims to be a Navi, and then gives an interpretation of a part of Torah that we have never heard in our tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu. Which the Rambam defined as somebody who's trying to contradict Moshe's nevuah, which actually makes sense to us. But surely he's also then doing exactly what we've just learned, contradicting the Torah that tells us Torah is no longer in heaven. So insights into Torah are not presented through prophecy. It's that basis of Torah lo b'shamayim, that Torah is no longer in heaven, that precludes the possibility of a Navi introducing anything into Judaism that wasn't there before. And that's demselben pasuk welches is machish der was sagt Hashem tzivah shadim kach. It's exactly the same pasuk that we would use to prove that if a guy arrives and says, I'm a prophet and I've just received this halachic information from Hashem, we would reject him because Torah is not in heaven. And the Rambam calls that person contradicting Torah. So that's really strange. The guy who wants to give an interpretation of Torah we've never heard before contradicts the same pasuk as the person who comes along and says, I have a halacha to teach you. Says, why would the Rambam then split them into two different categories and say, the person who comes along to claim a new insight into Torah, that is Moshe. He's contradicting Moshe's prophecies. And whereas the person who says, I have a halacha to teach, is Torah, he's contradicting the Torah. Surely they're actually both doing the same thing, claiming that you get Torah information from on high through a prophetic process, which is against Torah. So let's start off first by looking at the scenario of the guy who comes along and says, I'm a Navi, and everybody's got to serve Avodah Zarah on Wednesday afternoon between 2 and 3 p.m. So we say Navi Sheker. Says the Rambam, Zok the Rambam, let's start with that. Why would the Rambam call that person who's trying to tempt people to idolatry dafka a person who contradicts Moshe's nevuah? So maybe the answer is maybe it hinges on something that the Sifri says. Very interesting. The Sifri says that there's a pasuk v'diber eleihem, that you have to communicate to them who's you and who's them. Moshe communicating to the people. Says the Sifri that Moshe may not use an interpreter. He's got to speak directly to the people. Which implies, as the din von overall divra hanavi chayav misa. So the Sifri implies, doesn't say it outright, but implies that at which point would a navi sheker have to? At which point would a person who disregards what a navi says be chayav misa b'dei shamayim? Only in a situation where he heard the information directly from the navi and now rejects it or disregards it. And that would not apply if he heard the information via an interpreter. That's the Sifri. Now the Rogachover is going to add another layer to that. Applies actually to Moshe himself, and this is fascinating. The Rogachover is Mosef in them. As I feel of an ahetas mipiha navi atzmoi, even if the audience hears the information from the navi, not via somebody else, directly from the navi, is the chiv dafka of an ahetas from the navi be'eshem isnabe. Says the Rogachover, a person would only be liable for a capital offense if they reject a nevuah that they heard from a navi while the navi was prophesying. Mashenken, wenn hört das von dem Navi später. Whereas if we heard information from the Navi, let's say the Navi had his nevuah yesterday and he shares it with us today, then anybody today who would disregard that nevuah is not technically chayav misa b'dei shamayim because he didn't hear it v'diber aleihem, directly from the Navi. Noch dem wie is misnabe, is es as voltos gehört mit pi haturgman. So to hear the information at a later date from the original Navi is the equivalent, says the Rogachover, to hearing it via somebody else. So maybe that's the answer. So let's say now, as let's assume there was somebody who lived in Moshe's generation, who then disregarded or transgressed an instruction that Moshe gave. So surely now is doing the machilek tziyar is over mitzvahs avodah zarah, other andere mitzvahs. What happens next might be different depending if the subject matter we're dealing with is avodah zarah or a different mitzvah. By mitzvahs avodah zarah, let's say chas v'shalom, a Jew living in the time of Moshe served avodah zarah. Well, then we'll say you heard that directly from the Navi when he prophesied. Seeing as the entire Jewish people heard the instructions against avodah zarah directly from Moshe when he was on Har Sinai, having the experience of nevuah, and maybe we could argue the same for the other Aser Sadibros, but certainly those two. Then, if a person serves avodah zarah, they have transgressed avodah zarah, and they have transgressed the disregarding of a Navi's instruction. Mashenkin by under a mitzvahs, whereas if it was a different mitzvah that they heard subsequently from Moshe Rabbeinu, not on Har Sinai itself, we would now be hearing, or that person living in that generation would be hearing the information from Moshe Rabbeinu post the revelation of the Nevuah. That person may have transgressed mitzvah X or mitzvah Y, but they would not have transgressed the additional issue of disregarding what a Navi has to say. So maybe maybe that's why the Rambam makes the distinction between people who contradict Moshe and people who contradict Torah. So when he spoke about the Navi illustrating that somebody indicating or calling on people to go serve Avodah Zarah, what does the Rambam say? That's machish nevuah shel Moshe. That's a person who's contradicting Moshe's nevuah because we heard it firsthand. As the far as Okta by Avodah Zarah lachish nevuah shel Moshe. So mirna mezayin as in dem tziva for Moshe for Avodah Zarah is for nocha inyan miyuchad. Maybe that's what the Rambam wanted us to know. That specifically in the scenario of a Navi who calls for Avodah Zarah, there's another layer of transgression. Over and above the fact that this is a transgression of an instruction in the Torah, do not serve idols. There's the added layer of the person going against an instruction they heard from a Navi while the Navi was prophesying. Which would then add another layer that any person living in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu who would serve Avodah Zarah would deserve the heavenly decree of death, because they transgressed something that the Navi said and they heard the Navi say while he was having the Nevuah. And that's a halacha that would be absolutely unique to Avodah Zarah, because those are the mitzvahs that we heard from Moshe b'shas hanevuah. Therefore, the Rambam would only apply it to the person who says that I'm a prophet and I'm telling you to serve idolatry. Whereas if the person claimed to be a Navi and wanted to uproot any other area of Torah, would say that's not a specific affront to Moshe's Nevuah, but it is a contradiction of the Torah. Maybe that's why the Rambam said it that way. The problem is it still leaves us with a problem. How come earlier on at the beginning of the chapter, which was not talking about a scenario of Avodah Zarah, and yet the guy wants to add a mitzvah, take away a mitzvah, he calls that contradicting Moshe's Nevuah. Why? If it's only in Avodah Zarah that we have this unique category of having heard the Nevuah while it was happening, and therefore there's an additional transgression, why would the Rambam apply it to another scenario that is not about Avodah Zarah? So besides that, is oich de klolus habir, besides the sticking point that you still haven't answered for the one lahachish nevuah shel Moshe, besides that, the overall explanation doesn't make sense. As mit in lashon lahachish nevuah shel Moshe meint der Rambam zu meramazan dem chemisi b'dei shamayim b'dei shel Moshe, to try to suggest that all the Rambam wanted to allude to by using these words, lahachish nevuah shel Moshe, was to talk about something that would be unique to those people living at the time of Moshe. That's a doicha gadol. That's a real stretch. First of all, if that's a halacha that would only apply to people who lived in Moshe's generation, why is it relevant to us? It's doch maida hava hava. That's the past. The past is not relevant in our lives now, and the Rambam surely is paskening for the present as well. Secondly, the idea that a person who serves Avodah Zarah would now deserve Misa B'dei Shamayim because of the fact that they went against the Nevuah they heard at the time of the Nevuah is the It's actually got nothing to do with who told them to do it. What's the problem? They were not supposed to do Avodah Zarah because they heard from the Navi at the time the Navi was sharing it. Who cares now if it's some other Navi who comes along to tell them now that they should serve Avodah Zarah? That's a moot point. No mitzvah inyan from avodah zarah. It's the fact that it's avodah zarah, which is the mitzvah they heard directly from Moshe. That's what counts. Then emetzer from der midbar didn't avodah zarah. That should somebody who was present at the time and heard from Moshe Rabbeinu now serve avodah zarah. Regardless of whether the person claims that they have a prophetic mandate or imperative to serve avodah zarah, is a chai misibidei shamayim, he would require to die in Hashem's hands. So if that's the case, is if the Rambam if the Rambam really wanted to draw our attention to this unique scenario that only applies to avodah zarah and only for the people of the Der HaMidbar, really the place that Rambam should have discussed it would have been in the halachas of avodah zarah, because that's where it is relevant. It actually has nothing to do with the quality of this particular Navi, if he's a true or false Navi. It's not part of this conversation. The Rambam should not have mentioned it here. So we're back to square one. We need to understand what is it that the Rambam wants us to know about the nature of a Navi Sheker. Why is there a distinction between sometimes the Navi going against the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu and sometimes against the Torah itself? And in order to understand that, we have to go back to something we alluded to right at the beginning of the discussion, and that is the fundamental difference between words of Torah in their original form versus words of Nevuah, which are also Torah, but somewhat different. To understand all of that, we'll do a précis of a concept that we are familiar with. In dem was man hat der Mann früher Sifalef, something we mentioned at the beginning of the Sikha, the distinction that we find, firstly halachically and in other areas of Torah too, and the Maila for Mitzvahs Are Not Bar Sinai of the Tzivuim Shal Yedei HaNaveem, the huge advantage and greatness of mitzvahs that were given at Har Sinai over instructions that were given only through the Naveem. Where do we learn this from? We all know this. Commenting on the first word of the Aseret HaDibros, which encapsulates the whole of Torah. The Gemara Shabbos famously tells us, Anochi is an acronym for I have written and presented my soul in the Torah. In other words, as the Eibishter hat sich reingeschrieben und reingegeben in Torah. It's almost as if to say that the Eibishter put himself into writing and made himself absolutely available to us through Torah. To put it in different words of a medrash, as durch Torah is oisi atem loichim. That's how the medrash says it. Through Torah, you actually, so to speak, take Hashem for yourself. Was der Fall ist, that implies, as the Mitzvah Torah seien nicht nur ein Mittel zu Kabbalah Schar. This is incredibly important. Mitzvahs are not a means to an end. You don't do mitzvahs now as an investment in order to get something in the next world. Oder zu der Greichen die Meile ve'ile von Skule Gomer Mamlechas Kana ve'Goy Kadosh. And we don't do mitzvahs in order to be that special treasured nation of Hashem while we're in this world. In other words, mitzvahs are never a means to an end. Na euch ve'ikra as in ze gufa bashtet mechufim v'tachlis. Anoichi, the mitzvah is the goal. The mitzvah is the absolute. As the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, schar mitzvah, the reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah. You don't need anything beyond that, because the essence of Hashem is encapsulated within the mitzvah. Just as it would be completely unthinkable to suggest that Hashem is a means to anything else, or services something else. Also ist es nicht scheich zu sagen, wenn geht zu den Mitzvahs HaTorah, was in sei is dort anon nafshi. So if Hashem puts himself into the mitzvahs in exactly the same ways, you can't say chas v'shalom that Hashem is a means to an end or an accessory to something else. You cannot say that any mitzvah is a means to an end or an accessory to something else. It has absolute value in and of itself. And das is eich der Tam, was mitzvahs b'Torah sein l'olam. That's why mitzvahs are eternal. And that's why they can't change or be added to or detracted from. What is a mitzvah? What is the real essence and content of a mitzvah? The Eibishter himself. So they can't change, grow, diminish, switch out. Because the Eibishter is not going to ever change. So if he placed himself in the mitzvahs, they cannot change. Or to say it in different words. If Hashem's intention had been, as some people believe, that mitzvahs are just tokens that you use in order to redeem points in the next world. or to the Greichen Amayla v'chule Kenal, or to get you status in this world as the treasured, chosen people. Then involved given Shaykh to Zogin, then you could definitely say, as Ashinoi, that there be changes. Aliyah or Yerida, sometimes there be an increase, an elevation, detraction. In the Mekayim mitzvahs or Gerim Zana Chelek in the mitzvahs. So if the person doing the mitzvah has ups and downs, the mitzvah they do will also have ups and downs. More reward, less reward. More status, less status, depending on what I'm doing. But because Hashem's will that drives Torah and mitzvahs is absolute, it is the essence of Hashem, it is beyond the finite capacity for change. This is what the Eibishter wants, because the Eibishter wants it. Nothing influences that choice. So nothing can influence a change in that choice. Just as that tells us the essence of what Torah and mitzvahs is all about, it helps us to understand the tremendous advantage over Torah instructions that were given at Har Sinai over the words of a Navi. What kind of instructions do Naveem give us? They tell us, go to a certain place, don't go to a certain place, as the Rambam spells out, etc. In other words, that means the Naveem are giving us instructions to service a particular outcome that needs to happen. Go to that place because you have to do X. Do these steps in order that you should win the war. On the far side, which means that they are fundamentally temporary instructions. And not only that, but even if the Naveem should introduce all kinds of instructions to keep everybody on the straight and narrow, to preclude us from transgressing, like for example the pasuk that says, remember the Torah of my servant Moshe. It's like a call to keep the integrity of our Judaism. Again, the goal is not the zichru, it's the Torah's Moshe. It's not the remembering, it's the Torah that has to be preserved. So every time a Navi presents something that is an instruction of a Navi, it is always for a specific purpose. Mashen ken divrei Torah, which is totally different to Torah, is be'ikah ze gufa zayne ritzona shel mokim shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu ritzona atzmi. The mitzvah is the goal. The mitzvah is the essence of what Hashem wants. It is never a means to an end. That's the most reasonable explanation for why a Navi may not add anything to the Torah. Because the word of Hashem conveyed in Torah is far superior to the word of Hashem, as will come through the instructions of a Navi. So what do we see? Torah and Nevuah are very different manifestations of divine energy. Torah is absolute ratzon that doesn't service another ulterior motive, and a Navi's instructions are very much about achieving goals beyond their instructions. Now here's the thing. We have now illustrated that the power and intensity of Torah is far superior to that of a Navi, on the one hand, and therefore that's why Torah is absolutely immutable and eternal. It's for exactly that reason that we as people get a certain value out of the words of prophets that we don't necessarily get out of the words of Torah. Because Torah is the Ratzon Atzmi Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, considering that Torah is the Eibishter's essential will. That places it as something which is infinitely beyond our comprehension, our grasp, our personal connection. And therefore, it's not possible for us to ever grasp the essence of Torah. It's totally beyond us. Whereas prophecy, the whole purpose of prophecy is for Hashem to share His insight, energy, wisdom with people, as the expression goes, Gila Soidoi. Hashem revealed His secrets via the Naveem in Zeyer Geder to us in our reality. Obviously, the Navi has to qualify first to be in a position to be able to convey that information. It's got a huge benefit to us because the Navi speaks a language we can relate to. And the Navi takes this immense divine energy and packages it in a way that we can appreciate so that it makes our emunah stronger. With that information, now that we understand that Torah is the most pristine form of divine will and wisdom, and Nevuah is the most packaged form of divine will and wisdom, we can understand what the Rambam is trying to tell us. Now we can understand the detail the Rambam enters into when he explains in Dem Oifen Ha'emunah Funidin in Nevuas Moshe and Torahs Moshe, where he goes into so much detail explaining how it is that we have so much faith in the Nevuah and by extension the Torah of Moshe. The Rambam's not just telling us a story because we want to know why does this belong over here. It belongs in Moreh Nevuchim because it's not a story, nor a halacha. It's actually the definition of the legal reality of Moshe's teachings. And in der halacha sein in dort zwei inyanim, and it's in two acts. It's got two parts to it. Number one, Aleph, der Munah was darf glauben in was Moshe darf sein betekef havados. The first thing we have to know is that the faith we as Jews have in the validity of Moshe's message has to be crystal clear. And emunah shleima she'ein bo doifi. It has to be absolute without any queries, without any doubts. Base, secondly, to get to that point, that we have that kind of emunah, that kind of absolute crystal clear emunah cannot be built on wonders and signs. It has to be personal experience. We saw it, we heard it, which is the only way that a person can arrive at a point where you have rock solid emunah without any tremors. Now, derech zeis man gev was der Rambam is masber for was man darf nicht glauben und nicht folgen der Navi, was is bola hachish nevuos shel Moshe. Following that same line of thought, that explains why we dare not listen to a person who claims to be a Navi yet contradicts what Moshe has to say. Even if a guy is doing the most amazing miracles, the Rambam has to tell us the foundation of why Moshe's nevuah is valid has nothing to do with miracles, which would then lead us to start comparing that kind of miracle to that kind of miracle. We saw it and heard it. And the Rambam has to tell us this is a ridiculous proposal. Here's somebody who's trying to contradict what you saw and experienced yourself. The Rambam's not bringing that just to give us a logical, philosophical explanation. Why not to listen to that Navi? Nora halacha. He's giving us a definition, a legal definition. It's a legal definition that has two components to it of what makes Moshe's nevuah so compelling. Aleph, the first element is the toikef havados in the emunah dav sein ad kedei kach, the absolute clarity of this emunah in Moshe's message has to be so clear that it doesn't matter what miracles you see, they won't shift you one iota from your faith in Moshe. That's the first thing. It's going to be so good. That's the halacha. The halacha requires that we believe Moshe's nevuah so strongly that you could do the most amazing miracles and it will mean nothing to us. Secondly, how do you reach a point where this fancy pants Navi comes along and starts doing all these amazing miracles and it doesn't shift us? That's that's where by a person effectively explaining to themselves, why on earth would I listen to somebody who does fancy tricks when I've seen and experienced something myself? Because logic says that the greatest miracles in the world cannot shift you from a position of something that you witnessed and experienced. Das heißt, dass die schlimmste Teike von Muchlat, the absolute commitment von ein Sheminloi, not to listen to that Navi, is mitzadem, was das balachish nevasa shel Moshe, sherainu v'shashamanu. The reason I'm rock solid and not budging, in spite of what he's putting on a show about, is because of how can a person come along and contradict what I saw. And that actually could even have an halachic application. This is something we've all seen in halacha, how when a person sees something with their own eyes, it is so compelling that they actually can't shift their position afterwards. Is the halacha ein eid nasa dayan, that a person who witnessed an event cannot be a judge in that case. Because he saw the event with his own eyes. So he can't be a real judge, because a judge always has to have the capacity to possibly come up with a defense for the defendant. Now, he was a witness. How could he possibly shift his position and defend the person he saw do a particular thing? Whereas the same judge might hear testimony literally from hundreds of expert witnesses and still has the capacity to remain objective. So that's just an illustration of the fact that when you've seen something yourself, it becomes so real to you that you can't shift your position. That's what the Rambam is telling us, is the halacha of what our level of faith in Moshe's nevuah has to be. Nothing in the world is going to upset our commitment. Now let's take this a step deeper. Why do we need the nevuah of Moshe to give validity to Torah? Why did the Eibishter ensure that the nevuah of Moshe should be so solid, that we would all witness it? Dafka by Maimed Har Sinai, and where would we witness Moshe's nevuah? Specifically, when we were at Mount Sinai getting the Torah. With the Rambam is Marich Bazeh, which we saw the Rambam makes a big deal about, is weil the Tachlis von Nevuas Moshe is because here it gives us an insight into what the value and purpose of Moshe's Nevuah is. To Peil sein as bei Eden soll der Herd werden, nicht nur der Emes Havayla kim von Elokus Bichlal. The goal of Moshe's Nevuah is not only should Hashem be absolutely clear and real to us, but that the validity of Torah, which is, by definition, totally beyond us, should be absolutely real to us as well. The fact that we saw and we heard Moshe's Nevuah, that gives us absolute, unshakable faith, also in the truth of Torah. In other words, if we had just been exposed to Torah, maybe it would remain a little bit abstract to us. We wouldn't necessarily have that clarity. But when you have a Navi standing there, engaging and interacting with you directly at Maimed Har Sinai, and it's absolutely clear and non-negotiable that this is what is happening, it helps you to consolidate the validity of the Torah as well. And then why specifically would Torah be consolidated through the nevuah of Moshe Dafka? Well, it's quite logical that would be because Moshe Rabbeinu has the ultimate type of nevuah that exists. The ultimate nevuah means he has both of the extreme elements that make up nevuah. On the one hand, what was revealed to Moshe through his nevuahs was the ultimate kind of revelation that is ever possible. Clear visions, no riddles. On the one hand, so what was shared with him is way beyond what was shared with anybody else. Highest level of nevuah. On the one hand. And on the other hand, is that he didn't collapse into a fit or into a dream state in order to get his nevuah. He stood like an ordinary person, channeling the nevuah without flinching. That means that Moshe has the unique position of being a Navi who receives nevuah while very much embedded in the physical reality. He doesn't have to step out into an unconscious state. Und der Riber is seine nevuah kelet zarop tragen Torah shel meinem nivroim in geder hanivroim. That's why Moshe's nevuah is the perfect channel to bring the ultimate truth of Torah, Torah being way beyond the human experience, in fact, way beyond the whole of the created experience, and to bring it down into our world, because Und so often by Zedem take for Emunah Vaisamtos in Torah, because Moshe's straddling both worlds. He's having the highest level of Nevuah and he's bringing it down into a very tangible reality. Therefore, he could make the Torah so tangible and real to each of us. And that explains why in the subsequent chapter 9, when the Rambam tackles the possibility of a person who claims to be a Navi, who was sent to add a new mitzvah, does says there is machnish gamitus Torah. In other words, what is he trying to say? He's trying to say the Torah is not valid because we can add or we can reinterpret. There the Rambam says, you know what's wrong with this guy? He's contradicting Moshe's nevuah. Doesn't it stamay choch as there is an Navi sheker? Not like we said right at the beginning of the Sikha. Oh, maybe the Rambam just wants to prove to us how we know that he's a false Navi. Not the mitzvahs the Rambam mechadesh nocha halacha. The Rambam is now giving us a whole different legal insight into the status of this Navi. Chachas nevuas Moshe is lamata fun Torah. Even though, as we said, nevuah, including Moshe's nevuah, is a lower manifestation of godliness than the Torah itself. But because, as we have identified, Moshe's nevuah consolidates the Torah, clarifies that it's absolutely true and therefore immutable, can't change. Therefore, no other Navi could ever in any way innovate with regards to Torah. That's why we have to push back so strongly to not pay any attention to the great miracles of this so-called self-proclaimed Navi. Why? The whole basis of that is Moshe's nevuah. So this person who's trying to introduce something new to the Torah is effectively trying to uproot Moshe's nevuah, because Moshe's nevuah is how we know that Torah is completely immutable. With all of the information that we have gathered, we can now see the flow of why the Rambam presents things in the particular order that he does in the halachas regarding a Navi in Hilchos Yesod HaTorah. In Perek Zayin, the 7th chapter, that's where the Rambam introduces the general principles about how Nevuah works. And while he's doing that, and the fact that Moshe is the ultimate Nevuah possible. He goes into so much detail as we know. That's chapter 7. Then after telling us about how amazing Moshe's nevuah is in the next Perek Ches, he tells us, besides the greatness of Moshe's nevuah, that he had the kind of vision that nobody else had, and that he was able to hold his own physically at the same time. Over and above that, adds the Rambam another whole layer. That what adds a layer of validity to Moshe's nevuah, the fact that he presented his nevuah to us at Har Sinai. And it was an absolutely compelling nevuah because we saw it and we heard it ourselves. Once he tells us that, so there's another layer to Moshe's nevuah, the fact that it was consolidated at the time of Har Sinai and therefore consolidates the Torah for us. Once the Rambam has clarified that there's this very unique connection between Moshe's nevuah and the presentation of Torah at Sinai, then he says in the next Perek, that Moshe's nevuah is what consolidates our faith in the Torah, which is fundamentally beyond us and even beyond nevuah. And that translates into the understanding and acceptance of the fact that the Torah is absolutely eternal. And therefore no Navi can ever innovate new information or insights into Torah. Over Mela, which has a practical application, should a Navi appear and start to claim that Hashem sent him to add something, is a machish nevuah shel Moshe. Says the Rambam, that would contradict Moshe's nevuah, because Moshe's nevuah is the foundation on which the whole validity of Torah is solidified. But you will notice that the Rambam only uses the expression that somebody contradicts Moshe's nevuah. That specifically the Rambam talks about a person who claims to be a Navi and wants to now add or detract a mitzvah from the Torah. Or the person who claims that we should serve chas v'shalom idolatry. But when the Navi's claim is that he just wants to uproot something that we had been passed through the tradition, or he claims that a certain halacha has been given to him from on high, then there the Rambam does not consider that specifically a contradiction of Moshe's nevuah, no lachish Torah, but it's simply a contradiction of Torah. Why? So the beer in them, it's a very simple explanation. When a Navi claims that he was sent by God with the mandate to add or delete a mitzvah, or to give an interpretation to a mitzvah, something we haven't got as part of our tradition from Moshe. And obviously, how much more so if he claims that Hashem says you should serve idolatry. Any one of those arguments is a direct attack on what we witnessed and experienced at Har Sinai, that the Torah is eternal. What happened at Har Sinai is that the Eibishter illustrated clear to us that he gave Moshe Rabbeinu as the conduit for all information of all Torah that will never change. This guy who claims that he has information about Torah that will change is rejecting that fundamental principle. And as we've already said, what happened at Har Sinai is something we saw with our own eyes and heard with our own ears. So then clearly this person is rejecting Moshe's nevuah because we saw Moshe give us the information that this is Torah and it's never going to change, and this person wants to change it. Whereas the person who arrives and says, I've got a new halacha that I want to introduce, this has to change. Or I have an endorsement from Hashem that the way I'm paskening is in a particular way. It's not rejecting the whole principle of Torah. It's talking about one specific halacha that he says has to be modified. It's not adding a new mitzvah, saying there's within the mitzvah there's a particular halacha that's got to be modified one way or the other. And he claims that his prophetic insight tells him that the halacha has to be expressed in a particular way. He may even present an accurate halacha. Could be that he's looking to endorse something the Torah tells us. Now the pale is even from Paskan halachas hefech v'natziva b'Torah. The problem is that to arrive at an halachic conclusion based on a so-called prophetic insight, that is illegal. That is against the Torah. That goes against the fact that the Torah says Torah is no longer in heaven. So this is not a person who is contradicting Moshe's nevuah. Moshe's nevuah represents the whole principle of what Torah is. Eternal divine wisdom that may not be changed. This is a person who's saying this particular halacha has to be modified. So this person is contradicting the Torah. Because his entire affront is only to a specific halacha within an area of Torah, but he's not trying to challenge the entire validity of Torah as was presented at Har Sinai, and therefore Niti Yesoda Kol Torah is not. He's not trying to challenge the principles of the foundations of Torah. He's not attacking that which was endorsed and consolidated by Moshe's nevuah, which we witnessed ourselves. So effectively, that's what the Rambam is telling us. Two very valuable principles. There's a difference between Torah and nevuah. Torah is the original source. It has no ulterior needs or motives, whereas the words of a Navi may be there for a specific purpose outside of their words. And then he tells us, Nevuas Moshe Rabbeinu helps us to bring the Torah into terms that we can all relate to, so that we know absolutely that the Torah is Hashem's essence and the essence of Hashem's will, and therefore can never be shifted. Anybody who rejects that, rejects Nevuas Moshe Rabbeinu, which effectively means rejects the foundational principles of Torah, whereas a person who only rejects a particular specific area of Torah, even by claiming to be some kind of a Navi, has broken with a rule in the Torah, but hasn't necessarily undermined all of the fundamentals.